if you haven't or do not know what happens in Mary Poppins, this is a podcast to skip.
Hello and welcome to the Good Practice podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Dickie, and this week we're asking what L&D can learn from the world of cinema. In supporting roles, we have my Good Practice colleagues Owen Ferguson. Hello, Owen.
Hello, Ross.
Ross Garner. Hello, Ross.
Hello, Ross.
Gemma Towersey.
Hi, Ross.
Hello, Gemma. And Stewart Hardie. So, Stewart, given this episode was your idea, do you want to kick us off? So, just to give a brief overview of the format for the show, we're each going to be sharing a movie, giving a brief sort of overview of what it's about, and then saying what we can learn from it as L&D professionals.
So to give you an idea of what the inspiration behind this episode was, rather than maybe spell out the lesson, first of all, is I was recently watching a film called Inception, which came out about 9 years ago. And in Inception, the premise is there's a billionaire businessman in that, and he basically wants to find a way of encouraging his biggest business rival to dissolve his father's empire, but he's got no way of doing this other than, he can't do it through threats, he can't do it through pure competition alone. So what he does instead is he hires this team of dream architects, if you like, to infiltrate the dreams of this person, his rival, and essentially create a bunch of scenarios through these dreams and interactions. And I'm glad I've got instructional designers on the podcast, because I found myself thinking that quite a lot of what this team of dream engineers, if you like, are going through could be seen as quite similar to instructional design. And that was maybe a lesson or point of discussion that I wanted to talk about in a conversation, first of all, but I think it came to coming to a good idea for a podcast. So to add further credibility to my point, we start off a clear outcome in mind. So the chap in question will dissolve his father's empire. To get there, there's a team of people designing a bunch of convincing scenarios and interactions in order to coax the target towards that outcome. They bring the client along on the journey. So Mr. Saito, who is the chief billionaire that I mentioned in the first place, is involved in the dreamscape. And of course, it wouldn't be fun if everything went to plan. So things do go wrong occasionally, requiring these architects, designers, if you like, to change tack occasionally.
I love the thought of Ross casting himself in the Leonardo DiCaprio role. You see him?
Oh, it sounds like you've cast me in that role. I like the idea of the dream engineer as a job title. That sounds much sexier than instructional design manager.
Be much easier to explain what you do as well.
Yeah, it's a sort of Machiavellian, making people do stuff and making them think it's their idea is ultimately the purpose of instructional design. Behavior change. We're winning over hearts and minds.
It's like next level instructional design, isn't it? You know, once we've stopped mucking around with all the stuff that we're currently using, the next thing is to invade people's heads and muck around with their dreams.
Because so it applied to a health and safety context, because that's often it's an easy area to talk about. While someone sleeps, you could have them set on fire or hurl them down some stairs. All sorts of ways to
in their dream.
In their dreams, yes. So they wake up
not while they're sleeping.
Yeah, sorry.
That wasn't clear from what you were saying.
In their dreams,
setting fire to someone who was asleep.
That'd be even more effective. Think of the feedback. They would be like, "Oh, never going to let that happen again." I like it, Stuart.
Yeah, I like it as well.
And maybe there's a clear lesson. I like the fact that the outcome isn't explicit to the person who's going on that journey.
Yes,
comes to
that's good. I was
themselves.
deeply skeptical of your film choice at first, but I think you won me over when you said bringing the client along on the journey. That was the point that you won over my heart and mind.
Who would like to go next? Owen, do you want to step up to the plate?
I suppose that was a preemptive maneuver there. So my first pick is Jaws. Not necessarily from the content of the film itself, but from the reported accounts of how the film got made. Do we need a synopsis of the film, Jaws?
There's a big shark and it eats people.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So shark terrorizes small coastal town, killing a bunch of people, and eventually the local sheriff, a marine biologist, and a grizzled fisherman hunt it down. So the film was directed by Steven Spielberg, and the shooting of the movie was well known to be beset by a range of problems. One of the best known of which was that the mechanical shark that they wanted to use in the shots of the shark kept on breaking down. So they had to make this film about a shark, but without the shark. And what it meant was that they had to improvise. So they kept the shark hidden, and they allowed the audience to infer what was happening through brilliant direction, basically. And as a result, they also had to change the script so it had more focus on characters than on spectacle. And the end result of that was the start of the blockbuster. Jaws was the kind of original summer blockbuster, and it was a movie that brought in over $1 billion in today's money at the US box office. And I think the useful lessons that you can take from that are that it doesn't matter who you are or how much money you've got at your disposal. Sometimes things go wrong, and it's how you adapt to those challenges that it makes the difference in terms of whether you have a success or not. But also, I think most of all, that constraints can actually lead to better outcomes. I don't think there's any doubt that Jaws is a better movie for not showing the shark all the time and keeping it kind of shrouded in mystery. So that was kind of like one of the sort of key lessons from Jaws. And also, just from the content of the film itself, I think it's worth noting that no one pays any attention to the expert marine biologist until a bunch more people are dead, which I think emphasizes that it is worth sometimes paying attention to who know what they're talking about.
I think the other thing with the Jaws shark is that no one believes it to be a shark once you see it on screen. They really lucked out not having it on screen at all. And also, the book Jaws is excellent and not at all about a shark. It's about adultery. So just as a side note, recommendation for the book it was based on.
But there is a shark in the book.
Oh, yes, there is. But I mean, it's in the book even less than it's in the film. Completely sidelined in its own book.
Right. That's an interesting title for the book, given that it's not the main focus of it. Oh, well. Punchier than adultery, I suppose.
I wouldn't know, Owen.
I think the point about limitations is really interesting, and obviously in those circumstances. So the idea was that they would have shown the shark if they hadn't had so many problems with it. Were they originally intending to? Yeah. So actually, they would have gone a different direction, but you can almost choose. I guess one of the takeaways you could have from that is that actually, imposing your own limitations on projects can be beneficial as well, in sort of narrowing the scope of what it is you're trying to do, or not sort of necessarily going for the flashiest solution to something.
That's your budget's getting cut, Ross.
Yeah. More money and resources doesn't necessarily end up with a better result.
Sometimes it does.
Sometimes it does. And sometimes it doesn't.
Oh, that pearl of wisdom. Ross, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I wanted to talk about The Matrix, which is like the QI buzzer klaxon of all L&D lessons from film possible topics. I think it's the most obvious one to pick. It's the one that here talked about quite a lot at conferences and stuff. What if to help people learn our work, we could just shove a jack in the back of their head and download whatever they need to know, and then they'll be an expert in something. But I think close watchers of The Matrix, I'm not going to go into what it's about because I think everyone's seen it, will note that it doesn't work when you content dump Kung Fu into Keanu Reeves' head. He then gets put into a simulation with Morpheus and gets his ass handed to him. So what he actually needs to do is not have that instant performance support tool, but have some degree of instruction followed by a safe environment in which to practice and fail multiple times, but improve upon that. And so the dominant narrative, I think, in L&D is that we can get rid of all courses and instructional design, and we'll just give people little bits of performance support whenever they need it. Little how-to guide to doing Kung Fu is all Keanu Reeves needs to save the day. And it's not the case. He actually needs formal instruction following a period of getting to know the basics. That was my lesson from The Matrix.
I wonder if that was just a deficiency in the information that got jacked into his head, though. Surely they could have given him all that other stuff as well.
Well, the experience of having lost, possibly. Yeah.
Oh,
could you live someone else's life?
I mean, they're plugging straight into his head.
Yeah, true.
I think it was a missed opportunity. Although it wouldn't have been as, dramatically satisfying if they had plugged it in the back of his head and he was just amazing and went on and won the day.
Well, I mean, if we're being honest, that is what happens later on. But
you could interpret that part of the film as being an early foreshadowing of the fact that he is a messiah delivered to this, the world, which is so inherent.
Don't bring up those sequels.
There's also the at the end of that training sequence. There's so after they're finished with their combat, they do the jump training sequence where he basically has to jump from one skyscraper to the next, and Morpheus does it flawlessly, and he's told it's all about freeing your mind. He doesn't make it and falls and hits the concrete. And then when he comes back out of the simulation, he does have, he can feel it. So there is actually like a consequence to him. It's not that it's an entirely safe environment. There are some consequences to him getting things wrong, I guess. So there's sort of like
feedback.
Well, we spoke before on this podcast, I think, about creating that kind of, was it with Danny Seals when he came on, about doing like presentation training, but then you're put into an environment where you have to give a presentation online. You don't realize that everyone listening is actually a recording, that they're not actually real people. You're just presenting. But there's consequence in the sense that you're in that you're in a position of heightened anxiety.
It feels real.
Yeah, it feels real.
Yeah.
Possibly going back to Inception. It's only afterwards that when you get to the end of the film, that you realize that there are no consequences. If you die, you just wake up and it's fine. And that was the problem with Inception, to loop back to Stewart's claim that it was a good film.
Gemma, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my first film is Moneyball. Has anyone seen it?
Yes.
No.
What?
Is it the baseball one?
Yeah, so it is based on
Aaron Sorkin.
Yeah, it's based on a book actually, but it's about a real life season of the Oakland Athletics baseball team in 2002, and it tracks how so that the team did really badly and they were about to hemorrhage all of their best players. And the coach needed to find a way of recruiting a new team, but with a really very limited budget. Traditionally, coaches have recruited based on intuition and the players that seem to have done really well. But what actually happened is that he met someone called Peter Brand, who was a Yale economics graduate. And this graduate used it's called the sabermetric approach. So he used the data to work out that actually the players out there in the US that seemed to be the best actually weren't necessarily scoring the runs or hitting the biggest hits, whatever the baseball metric.
Baseballing the baseball out of it.
Baseball, yes, indeed. So but using the data, Peter Brand, the grad, convinced Billy Beane, the coach, to look at other players that perhaps weren't as expensive, but actually had a better prospect of doing a good job. And so the coach did recruit those people and came under fire and lost a lot of friends, but he persevered, and they ended up doing really well. So the lessons were, through the film, you really get a sense that the coach is grappling with actually what is the goal, and it takes them a while to work out the goal is to recruit the best players rather than perhaps having the sort of most star-studded team. So there was a really kind of refinement of their goal, but most importantly, they look at the data. And so the data really spoke over trying to make decisions on intuition, which I think a lot of L&D, lots of decisions tend to be made on intuition rather than data. So I think that was the biggest lesson.
Is it the case that the superstar players are all really good at baseball? Pardon my complete ignorance of this. But was the data-driven approach that they were looking for different attributes in the players and how they would work together?
Yeah. And
It reminds me a little bit of the Super Chickens experiment. I can't remember where this is from, but I'll dig it out and put it in the show notes, where there was a, let's say it was along the lines of the 10 highest performing chickens were put into a coop together, and they all killed each other because they were vying to be the highest performing chicken. Whereas actually 10 average chickens performed better in a coop than the high performers put together.
Yeah, I think there's just the complexity around building teams. It helps by having the data. Yeah, and you can, yeah.
Interesting expansion on that maybe is that this is quite a topic of conversation on other podcasts around sports. I listen to a lot of ones on football, and a lot of famous teams are suffering right now because everyone assumes the agenda is to put together the best performing team possible so they can win everything, so on. But actually they're being undermined because there's this thing happening in the background where the executives at what's essentially a global organization, that's not their ultimate goal. Their ultimate goal is to make the most marketable team possible and get as much profit out of it. And that's how the best players don't necessarily end up playing. And it's the ones that are most marketable and the superstars who's got the most followers on social media instead.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a Moneyball. I mean, the book is amazing, and the films, I think, is a really good dramatization of it. It's actually incredible they managed to turn it into a film. So I remember when they announced they were making it, I thought, I'm not sure how they're going to do it. But it does. It's an incredibly compelling story. But it was really just the start of sports teams really starting to take data seriously to inform their decisions, and looking at what was the purpose of buying particular types of players, rather than look at the kind of like the most obvious raw metrics, which had always been gathered by baseball. They started to look at more sophisticated metrics that told a slightly more nuanced story, and he was able to construct this team. And the Oakland Athletics, for quite a considerable period of time, I think they had something like the third lowest payroll in the whole of the Major League Baseball, but they were one of the top performing team for years and years, until of course all the other teams cottoned on to this data stuff might be worth paying attention to, and all went off with it.
The other really interesting thing was that he took a risk on The Graduate, and and I think that's another really interesting thing that's come out of the podcast that Ross and I have been listening to about it's called 13 Minutes to the Moon, how the Apollo landing was actually, mission control was staffed by a bunch of 22-year-old graduates. And yeah, now I think there's a lot of bias and prejudice towards young people. Yeah, history has proven they can do good things too.
Well, since we paused, I'll just come in with this apolitical observation based on last night's news, which was on Channel 4, Jacob Rees-Mogg was being interviewed about Brexit, obviously. And he was saying that, the two teams in a football match are never as opposed as when it's 1-1, but then at the end, when the final whistle blows, they all go to the pub and they're all friends. Or at least that's how it is with cricket. And I thought, all right, so you started off down this football story and then you've lost confidence halfway through. And that's exactly what we sounded like, discussing baseball there. What's your film, Ross?
Oh, thank you for asking. So I was having some trouble coming up with movies, so I decided to go with one of the ones that I've seen most recently, which is Into the Spider-Verse. So it's the latest Spider-Man incarnation. And you might be thinking, there's far too many of those already. But this one, I think, is actually one of the better ones, if not the best one. So I'll give a brief synopsis for people who haven't seen it. Basically, the film sees student Miles Morales step into the role of Spider-Man, and he's pitted against the villain Kingpin, who is determined to use a super collider. He's trying to get his hands on a super collider so they can resurrect his deceased wife and son, which doesn't seem all that villainous, but the result of that is that it's going to cause all the universe to collapse in on itself, and mayhem will ensue. So the result, one of the side effects of this weapon is it opens up a gateway to a series of parallel universes, and each parallel universe has its own iteration of Spider-Man. So there are about 5 different Spider-Men within this film. The reason that it stood out to me from a learning point of view is there's a sort of 70-20-10 piece in there, because
is it surely the most obscure?
It might seem like this is shoehorned in there, but let me explain it. So Miles Morales steps into the role of Spider-Man after Peter Parker in his universe dies. However, there's another Peter Parker from a different universe that comes, except he's sort of overweight, he's slightly jaded, he's broken up with Mary Jane, he's sort of disillusioned with being Spider-Man, but he takes young Miles under his wing and teaches him how to be Spider-Man. So that's the sort of 10% part where he's like giving him formal instruction. But then there's also all these other Spider-Men that he can turn to for advice when it comes to sort of like actually confronting Kingpin and figuring out how they're going to stop him from using the super collider. But there's a quote in it that stood out to me. Peter says to Miles, "Everybody knows that the best way to learn is under intense, life-threatening pressure," which is not something we would advocate necessarily. But basically, the sort of gist of it is, as in all Spider-Man films, there are sort of training sequences where young Spider-Man is trying to get control of his abilities and just throwing himself off of buildings and trying to work out how his web slingers work, and he's like sticking to objects he doesn't intend to. And basically a lot of his training or learning how to be Spider-Man is actually done on the job because necessity forces him to actually apply his skills. So yeah, most organizations we're not necessarily dealing with life and death, but that was the sort of connection that I made there with Into the Spider-Verse.
I buy it.
Yeah, I can see that. But it does emphasize when he does get mentored by dad bod Spider-Man, he improves dramatically, right? So it does go to show that some formal level of support does help you along to a certain extent, and then he finds his own path once he starts, doing proper superhero things himself. Like he figures things out himself, but to get to that kind of like base level, he needed a leg up.
Or one-on-one instruction is the best kind of learning that you can get because you get the most tailored feedback to what you're doing. Sweeping statement.
Bold claim, yes.
It is a bold claim, I know, but I believe it.
One-on-one instruction is the best form of learning.
No, it is the best, and because that's one of the reasons that digital learning has digital learning has typically failed to do this because the feedback tends to be a bit crap compared to what you would get from an actual human being. And it's getting a little better, and you can be kind of tricksy with it, but there's also logistical reasons not to have one-on-one instruction for every single thing that you have to learn. But of course, that's the best way to learn. You want to train under a master. You can't just be downloaded Kung Fu, Owen.
and you need to be trained by a master, and so we move on. Has anyone got Star Wars picked?
Oh, I don't think anybody has.
Oh, goodness.
How has this happened? We all assume someone else would do it.
Yeah, a little bit on the nose.
Stewart, what's your next one?
So my next pick was Vertigo, but equally, that's what Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Equally, it could have been Godfather 2, it could have been Citizen Kane, it could have actually been Jaws, Owen. And the reason for that is that these films have...
Don't tell us.
They have two things in common.
Jaws, Godfather 2, Citizen Kane, and Vertigo. A male lead.
No. So
very broad subcategory.
the first thing is that they all regularly appear on the list of the best films ever. And the second thing is that I, Stuart Hardie, have never seen any of them. Commence verbal insults. My thoughts there.
Have you seen Star Wars?
I've seen Star Wars.
Then you get a pass.
So I was thinking about this, and I thought that so I know I enjoy all these films. I know I learn something from them. I know it enhance my ability to have interesting conversations such as the one we're having on this podcast. But I've just never felt I've had the time to do it, or there's always something more important that's popped up. It just comes to it's important to me, but not urgent, if that makes sense. And for that reason, they just keep on slipping down the list. And my feeling is that my treatment of these great films is probably quite similar to the way a lot of people treat their personal development.
Profound. Seriously, I like that. That's the best one yet.
So, what can we do to, other than saying, oh, yeah, it's really important and it's really good and you'll really benefit from it, to convince me to find time to watch these films, or make time, I should say, to watch these films. Likewise, what can we do to people who have got busy working lives and schedules to convince them that personal development and their learning should take priority over other things, other than saying it's really good and you'll really benefit from it and it's important?
Well, one option would be to leverage nudge theory, but I'm 10,000 words into a 15,000 word dissertation on this topic, and I don't think now's the time to get into it. But maybe we'll do a follow-up at some point.
I'll save that for another episode.
Yeah, exactly.
Owen, do you want to do your next one?
Sure. My second pick is Inside Out, which is a Pixar movie about a young girl called Riley who has to move home to a new city with her parents. But the real focus of the film is her emotions, who are portrayed as little characters that live inside her head and often disagree on how to help her adapt to her new life. And what I loved about Inside Out is that it shows us how important our emotions are in terms of how we react to the world. There's this brilliant bit which dramatizes how short-term memories are converted into long-term memories based on how relevant it is to us from an emotional perspective. And Pixar, as you might imagine, went off to speak to a bunch of cognitive psychologists to make sure that they weren't getting anything tragically wrong with that. There's a brilliant scene where Joy, who's one of the characters representing the emotion joy, highlights that all the emotions have a job to do. So disgust and fear are primary emotions that evolve to help us keep us safe. Anger is used in situations, in certain situations, as a form of protection. And all in all, it's a wonderful film. It's very entertaining. But there are worse ways to think about how your work affects people than thinking about how the emotions in Inside Out would react to your work. So I think it's slightly disconcerting that it's entirely possible that a film is a better focus of our attention than some of the neuroscience nonsense that's out there in the L&D world.
I like it. Sounds like the effective context model.
Yeah.
Some overlap there.
There is.
Reading its ugly head.
Yeah. How dare it.
I'm about to read it too.
Ross, do you want to do your next one?
Oh, right. Yeah, sorry. So, in every job that must be done, there is an element of fun. You find the fun and snap, the job's a game. And every task you undertake becomes a piece of cake, a lark spree. It's very clear to see that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. It's Mary Poppins, my next film choice. And I want to focus on that particular scene where she turns the tidying of the bedroom into a game, because she's turning it into something that's fun and that the children care about. And I don't want to be like corny and say, oh, we should make all learning fun, because I don't necessarily think that's the case. But what Mary's actually doing is finding something the kids are intrinsically interested in, which is playing a game, and leveraging it to get them to do what she wants. So similar to what Owen was talking about, this does seem to be like tapping into the emotions of what people care about in order to make people pay attention. It kind of loops back to, I guess, what Stewart was saying as well about professional development. People don't make time for it. So there's a health and safety course that we're working on just now, and in it there's a little animation. I don't say cartoon because that makes it sound flippant and everyone thinks, oh, it's not serious, but it's an animation. And for about 10 seconds, our main character tries to move a desk and drops it and falls down some stairs. Okay, so ostensibly the point is about how to lift a table responsibly. But actually the rest of the animation is about the breakdown of his marriage, because he's got this bad back and he's out of work and he can't play with his kids anymore and he starts snarking at everyone. And so what we wanted to do was drive the long-term consequences home and say, yes, this is how you lift a box, but here's why you should care about it, actually. And the chunk of what we were doing was the here's why you should care about it part. And I'm going to claim it was slightly inspired by Mary Poppins' little song.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I think that's an excellent point.
Oh my
I like the way that you linked. I just think that you miss out one of the key elements of that scene in Mary Poppins, in that one of the ways that she makes it fun for the kids is she uses magic.
Well, I like to consider my e-learning products a little touch of magic.
A sprinkling of fairy dust.
Excellent. All for it. More magic, please.
Gemma, more magic?
Okay, so my second film is Zootropolis. And the key point that I was going to make was about, I think the whole underlying message of the film is about prejudice and bias, and how the little bunny in the film, who is a police officer, Judy, she ends up right at the end of the film, just as the mystery about the missing predators has been solved, she accuses her foxy friend Nick of being just like all the other predators, how he's got hasn't got the restraint that the other mammals in the world have got, and he's just like all the other predators, and he is shocked and hurt by her accusations, and she is devastated, and so she leaves and goes away and reflects on what she said, and she comes to the realization that she had a bias, and that she hadn't really thought about all the qualities that Nick brought to their team. So she comes back and she apologizes, and Nick ends up joining the police with her, and they become great team members. But the point, I think, for L&D is to encourage everyone in an organisation to address their prejudices and look at the unconscious biases that they hold, and use this as part of your effective teamwork training. And suddenly, when you look at everyone's individual qualities, you might form even better partnerships.
I think that's really nice. I think what's really beautifully done in Zootropolis is that it's not other people who are prejudiced, it's the main character who've been rooting for who is prejudiced, and she realizes that she's prejudiced. Yeah. And it's something that came up quite a lot in our Women in Learning episode, that it's easy to say that other people are prejudiced. It's much more difficult to identify our own biases and the way that we feel about certain groups based on who we were surrounded by growing up, or our past experiences, and all those kind of things. So I think there's a great lesson there on reflecting on your reactions to people and how you might treat them differently. Ross, what's your next film?
So my next film is The Karate Kid, which is often held up as a great example from the movies of mentoring. So you have Mr. Miyagi and Daniel-san, and Mr. Miyagi is ostensibly teaching Daniel-san Kung Fu. Daniel-san knows that Mr. Miyagi is a Kung Fu master, and he is determined he commits to learning Kung Fu from Mr. Miyagi. And the sort of, even for people who haven't seen the film, they probably know wax on, wax off. And this is sort of one of the classic examples of him teaching Daniel-san Kung Fu. And I think you could probably, you could maybe argue that it's a good example of mentoring, in that he is he's giving Daniel-san all these sort of tasks that aren't sort of obviously teaching him Kung Fu, and sort of allowing him to get to that realization for himself. But I don't think he's being a very good teacher here. He's not it's kind of like the flip side to what you were saying, Ross, about Mary Poppins, in that he's not giving Daniel-san a reason to care about this. He's giving him all these like jobs like waxing his car or painting the fence. And even though Daniel-san knows that Mr. Miyagi is a Kung Fu master, he becomes very frustrated because he cannot make the connection between the tasks he's been given to do and the learning outcome that he is trying to get to, so that he doesn't get beaten up. So I think while it is held up as an example of mentoring in cinema, I don't know if it's necessarily a great example of teaching. It kind of comes back to what Nick Shackleton-Jones was talking about in your previous episode, about sort of creating positively affecting learning experiences. And I don't think that Mr. Miyagi is doing a very good job of that in The Karate Kid.
Is his objective to teach the boy Kung Fu, or is it to test how much he wants to learn? Is it not like it's a mental test to see if he'll stick it out, even though it's... I think,
yeah, I mean, that's kind of a sort of trope in kung fu movies generally, in that the student has to go through. They have to go through sort of lots of, not suffering, but they have to achieve a kind of meditative state for doing very simple things and sort of stripping down all the sort of excess in their life and just doing simple things and focusing on doing those things very well. And I think that that's great in kung fu movies, but most people would give up or think that it was boring and not engage with it.
It's you get to that surprise kind of aha moment where he eventually blows up and he says, what am I doing? You're making me, wax your car and paint your shed and, all the rest of it. And then he Mr. Miyagi demonstrates to him how actually he's been learning karate moves all the time. And isn't it wonderful? Right? And that must be, right, for the person receiving instruction, that must be an incredible moment of, oh my goodness me, right, it all makes sense now. And of course I'm going to continue.
Kung Fu.
Yeah. Yeah, they get to that point, but it's a really risky strategy to get to that kind of like incredible aha, what must be a highly motivating moment. You have to kind of run the risk that, as you say, Ross, that the person's just going to give up because they don't see what's the point in the stuff that I'm doing. I'm literally like I'm waxing this guy's car.
Well, yeah, as instructional designers, it's all about the whiffy at the beginning, the what's in it for me. That's everything. And if you can't see it,
the whiffy, that's very good.
Yes,
I'll remember that.
Yeah, I like it.
A great acronym.
Okay, so we'll move on now to what I learned this week, our regular feature where we each share something we learned in the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Is this just a thing that I always go first?
Pretty much.
Okay. There it is. I'll keep this one short.
It is a trope of the Good Practice podcast.
There's a great article in Forbes, which is not a phrase that I say all that often. That was flagged up by friend of the show Martin Cousins on Twitter a few days ago, called "Understanding Fake Agile" by a chap called Steve Denning, and it's basically it's an excellent takedown of how the word is being used increasingly in business as just a buzzword without any depth to it whatsoever. And in the article he outlines there are sort of like 3 key pillars to how whether what you're looking at is genuinely agile being put into practice in a business, or whether they're just they're carrying out all the ceremony without actually making any difference to business impact whatsoever. So I thoroughly recommend it as a read, but the thing that I picked out from it was one of the things he mentions is that some of the terms that are used for agile are in particular flavors of agile were deliberately chosen to be unappealing to management. So the reason why you've got terms like Scrum and Burn Down, etc., is that they were supposed to put off the management so that the teams could just get on with doing stuff. I thought that was hilarious.
That's very good.
Yeah, I like it. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Ross, do you want to go next?
Yeah, mine's really short. I learned a new word today, lexiconicism, which is the pretentious use of obscure words. Got that from the QI Twitter feed. Very good.
Excellent.
Amazing. Gemma?
So at the moment I'm reading a book called Underland by Robert Macfarlane. It's his latest book. Has anyone read any of Robert Macfarlane's books?
No, but I follow him on Twitter. His word of a day is very good.
It is. He's published a lot of books, but they all centre around. He just writes about the natural world. So he's written about the Highlands, and he writes about old walking routes, and so he writes incredible books. So this latest one is called Underland, and he spent 10 years gathering research and going on amazing trips underground, basically. So he writes a lot about mountains and hiking, but now he's decided to look at what's underneath our feet. And so he looks at he calls it the wood wide web, which is the connection between fungi and the trees and the plants that grow in woodlands, and how they're all interconnected and they share resources to keep each other alive. But the other places he goes to is the catacombs in Paris. And so this is the fact. There's apparently 200 miles of chambers and rooms and passages underneath Paris that you can go and explore, and there's subcultures of people that go and use those spaces, and they've tried to stop them from going down there, but they've not been successful.
What are the subcultures?
They have like music concerts and things, I think.
Right.
And you get there. I think there's like different people who've mapped it out because it's very easy to get lost, I think, in there. And you get sort of Marauder's map of the Paris catacombs.
Absolutely fascinating. What he got led on a guided tour. I think it took like a week. They were down there for a week or something. And you can sleep in these different caverns, and in one he found a timeline that had been etched into the wall, because they've all been basically, it's just like a big quarry, so they'd taken out the limestone and built Paris out of it, and there was a timeline that he found that the people that were the quarrying the rock had put in, and it sort of goes back to like 1800s, like 1700s. Amazing.
I think the cemeteries were full, weren't they? In Paris, and so they dug everyone up and then put them into these catacombs. I tried to go and visit them, and there's all the bit that's like opened up, and there was 200 miles of queue to get into them. So also, that is the third time I've heard someone mention this, the underground network of tree roots feeding each other in the past week. It's really freaking me out.
Stuart, what did you learn this week?
I've been reading a quite simple but interesting book called How Many Socks Make a Pair? And it's... forgive me, it's terrible of me, but I've forgotten who the author is, but we can put that in the notes, I guess. It's not a new book. And it's all about how fairly simple mathematics determines a lot of things that go on around us in everyday life. So this isn't complicated, but there's a chapter on probabilities, and it focuses a lot around flipping a coin and the probabilities associated with that. But one bit that I thought was a really nice lesson for me that I learned was actually a kind of like little text box aside embedded within the chapter, and it's very short, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. I've got it here. It's written by it's a psychological tip by Pete Hine, mathematician, scientist, and writer. He said, "Whenever you're called upon to make up your mind and you're hampered by not having any, the best way to solve the dilemma you'll find is simply by flipping a penny. No, not that so chance can decide the affair while you passively stand around there moping, but the moment the penny is up in the air, you suddenly know what you're hoping for." I thought that's pretty cool.
I like it. Yeah. What have you learned this week, Ross?
So it's not so much that I've learned this week, but I recently joined the instructional design team at GoodPractice. So until now, I've been working on the toolkit and writing content for the toolkit, but I recently joined the instructional design team. So I've been learning to use Evolve, our authoring platform, with the help of some webinars from the folk at Apoteer, but probably much more help from the likes of Ross and Gemma, and then also just a sort of good measure of playing around and learning by doing, and just sort of trying to build different courses. So cool. That's what I learned this week, or the last few weeks. And that is all for this week.
Karate Kid joke, something about... I'll say it later, you can add it in.
And we all laughed. And that's all for this week. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the show, you can find us all on Twitter. Owen is...
at Owen Ferguson.
Ross is...
your mic has just gone.
Oh. It's just cut out. Well, we'll insert it back in. I can take it from another episode.
Yeah.
Gemma is...
at Gemma Towersey.
Stewart is...
at S Hardie, i.e. 15.
And I am at Rostov_Dickie. You can also tweet at GoodPractice or at GoodPracticeAUS. To find out more about GoodPractice or Performance Support Toolkit, Bespoke e-learning and LMS, visit goodpractice.com. Next week, we'll be bringing you a recording of our live show in London. Ross and Owen, do you want to give our listeners a preview of what they can expect?
Yes, so there will be food and drink aplenty. Owen and I will be there. We'll be joined by Andy Lancaster, Michelle Paris-Slater and Gemma Critchley. We'll be talking about the past, present and future of learning. It's at 6:30pm at the Hand and Flower pub on the 12th of June. It's in London, and it's the first day of the CIPD Festival of Work. So if you're at CIPD Festival of Work, it's just across the road. You can come and join us there. There'll be drinks from 5:45 and then the show starts at 6:30.
It is the after party to attend. Tickets are available now, I think.
Yes, there are tickets available.
Yeah.
There'll be a link in the show notes. Also, at Ross Garner GP,
Thanks for listening. Bye for now.